The rosette burned against my retinas like a brand, gold and red in the manufactorum's smoke choked air. I had seen the Inquisitorial seal before, stamped on requisition orders and execution warrants, but never this close, never worn on living flesh, never accompanied by the smell of ozone and ceramite that meant power armor and storm troopers, and the absolute certainty that someone in this facility would die screaming before the day ended. My name is Theron Vask, and the moment I saw that rosette hanging from the Inquisitor's neck, my life split into two distinct periods: before, when I was a human being with hopes and routines, and the small dignities that make existence bearable, and after, when I became something else entirely, a survivor, a witness, a ghost wearing skin that no longer felt like mine. The manufactorum where I worked sprawled across 3 hive levels on Kratos Tertius, a world so polluted that rain fell black and tasted of rendered fat. We produced lasguns for the Astra Militarum, specifically the rifle stocks that cradled the sacred power packs and gave the common soldier something to brace against their shoulders when they died for the Emperor. Station 47, Gamma was mine, had been mine for 12 years, and I knew every scratch on the conveyor belt, every hiccup in the rhythm when the machines cycled into their blessing phase. The work was monotonous in the way that preserves sanity, each stock identical to the last, each prayer the same words in the same order until they stopped being language and became pure sound. Vibration, the human component in a ritual that pleased the machine spirits and kept production quotas acceptable. 600 workers shared my shift. Faces I recognized but rarely spoke to because conversation slowed the line and drawing attention meant trouble. We moved in synchronized patterns, our hands blessing wood while our lips recited the litany of function, and the overseers watched from gantries above with chronometers and data slates, recording our output and flagging anyone who fell behind. The air itself was thick with sacred oils and reclaimed protein paste from the meal hall 3 levels down, that particular stench that coats your tongue and lives in your clothes until you cannot remember what clean air tastes like. I had stopped noticing it years ago. The same way I stopped noticing the ache in my lower back, or the numbness in my fingers, or the way my bunkmate Hesha whispered prayers in her sleep, terrified that silence would let the warp seep in through her dreams. Hessia believed in the Emperor with the kind of faith that leaves no room for questions. She attended chapel twice daily, wore prayer beads that clicked against her wrists when she worked, and kept a small icon of the Imperial Ocula above her bunk, the paint chipped but the double-headed eagle still visible in the candlelight. I envied her certainty even as it exhausted me. My own faith was murkier, built less on devotion, and more on the pragmatic understanding that belief kept you alive, that the Imperium punished heresy and rewarded compliance, and survival meant performing the rituals whether you felt them in your soul or not. I kept my doubts small and private, splinters beneath the skin that hurt when pressed, but never infected into something dangerous. At least, that was what I told myself during the long shifts when the prayers felt hollow, and the Emperor seemed too distant to care about one factory worker on one factory world among millions. The morning the Inquisition arrived, Hessia and I had been arguing about prayer. She insisted the Emperor heard every word we spoke, that our voices reached terror through some mechanism we could not comprehend, that faith itself was the carrier wave. I had suggested, carefully, that perhaps the sheer volume of prayers across the Imperium created static, that individual words might get lost in the noise. She had looked at me with something close to horror, told me that doubt was how the warp found purchased, and made me recite the litany of protection 3 times, before she would let me leave for the meal hall. I had humored her because Hessia was my friend, one of the few people in the manufactorum who remembered my name, and because arguing about theology was pointless, when we both knew the truth, belief or doubt, the Emperor's gaze or his absence. None of it mattered as much as keeping your head down and your numbers clean. The meal hall occupied a converted storage bay, rockcrete walls stained with centuries of grease and the ghosts of old advertisements for products that no longer existed. We ate at long tables made from repurposed machine parts, 1,200 workers crammed into a space designed for half that. The noise level a constant roar of conversation and clattering bowls. The food was corpse, starch gruel, grey and flavourless, supplemented occasionally with protein chips that tasted like salted cardboard. I had learned to eat without thinking about the source, to let my mind drift while my body performed the necessary functions of consumption and digestion. The bowl in my hands was warm, the gruel thick enough to coat my spoon, and I was halfway through my ration when the Vox system shrieked. The feedback was deliberate, a weapon disguised as technical malfunction, and it drove through my skull like a spike. Around me, workers dropped their bowls, clapped their hands over their ears, and the gruel I had been eating sprayed across the table as my own bowl hit the rockcrete and shattered into fragments that skittered across the floor. The Vox grills mounted in the ceiling crackled, and a voice emerged, modulated through layers of augmetic enhancement until it sounded like something that had never been human, that had been born speaking with perfect clarity and zero warmth. All workers of Manufactorum 777 are to cease activity immediately. Maintain your current positions. Movement will be interpreted as resistance. Compliance is salvation. Resistance is proof of heresy. The God Emperor watches, and through his servants, he judges. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. 1,200 people froze mid-motion. Spoons hanging in air, conversations severed, breath held in communal terror. The machines in the levels below us continued their work, grinding and stamping and blessing, because machines did not fear the Inquisition, but we did. We feared it the way prey fears the predator's shadow, instinctively, viscerally, with the understanding that fear was not weakness but recognition of reality. Hesha's hand found my wrist under the table, her fingers cold and trembling, and when I looked at her face I saw the whites of her eyes all the way around, saw her lips moving in silent prayer, saw the faith she had always worn like armor cracking under the weight of actual danger. The gantries above us came alive with movement. Power armor does not sound the way you expect from propaganda reels and cathedral mosaics. There is no thunder, no majestic announcement of imperial might. Instead there is a whisper, a susurrus of servo motors cycling through motion algorithms, of ceramite plates sliding against each other with microscopic precision, of something massive moving with the silence of a hunting cat. The shadows on the gantries resolved into figures, 5 of them, descending the iron staircase with measured steps that rang against the metal despite the quiet of their armor. The leader wore black plate trimmed with purity seals, each one inscribed with names I could not read and prayers I did not recognize, and on his chest hung the rosette, the Inquisitorial seal that represented authority absolute and unquestionable. The Inquisitor reached the floor of the meal hall and stopped, standing in a pool of light from the overhead lumens that made his armor gleam like oil on water. His face was human, scarred, older than the armor suggested, with grey eyes that moved across the crowd in systematic sweeps. He did not look angry or zealous or any of the things I had expected. He looked calm, professional, like a man performing a task he had done 1,000 times before and would do 1,000 times again. Behind him came his retinue, 2 stormtroopers with helguns held at low ready, power cables glowing faintly blue. A scribe hunched under the weight of a data, lectern welded to his spine, his fingers already dancing across input keys I could not see. A servo skull wreathed in brass and suspensor tech, its eye sockets replaced with auspex units that swept the crowd in methodical patterns, and an interrogator, a woman whose face was hidden behind a rebreather mask, whose hands were wrapped in leather gloves that creaked when she flexed her fingers. The Inquisitor's voice carried without amplification, another gift of augmetics or training, or something I did not want to consider. You are servants of the Imperium. You labor in his name. You eat his rations, you breathe air he provides. In return he asks for purity, for faith, for vigilance against the enemies that surround us on all sides. He paused, letting the words sink in, and I could feel the collective tension in the hall, could smell the fear, sweat rising from 1,200 bodies pressed too close together. This manufactorum produces weapons for the Emperor's armies. Corruption here does not simply endanger you, it endangers every soldier who holds the lasguns you bless. It endangers worlds. It endangers the Imperium itself. He gestured, and the servo skull descended from his shoulder, spiraling down to hover at eye level above the crowd. Its auspex units glowed red, scanning faces, cross-referencing data from archives I could not imagine. Some of you are innocent. Some of you harbor corruption, knowingly or unknowingly. You may have been exposed to warp, tainted materials, to Xeno's influence, to the whispers of chaos. You may not even know you are infected. That is why we are here, to identify the threat, to excise it, to ensure that the Imperium's work continues uncompromised. He drew himself up, and the purity seals on his armor rustled like dry leaves. Those who are pure have nothing to fear. Confess your doubts, your dreams, your moments of weakness, and we will determine if you can be saved. Hide them, and you condemn yourself. The purge began with the overseers. There were 20. 3 of them scattered throughout the manufactorum, men and women who had risen through the ranks by attrition and competence, who carried data, slates and chronometers, and the weight of production quotas that could break a worker's spirit as surely as physical labor. Kellen was pulled forward first, the man who had supervised my section for 8 years, who had lost his left eye to a servo skull malfunction and never bothered with augmetic replacement. He walked to the center of the hall without resistance, his shoulders squared, his empty eye socket weeping clear fluid down his cheek. The interrogator circled him, her rebreather hissing with each breath, and her questions were too quiet for me to hear from where I knelt at my table. Kellen answered each one, his voice steady, his hands clasped behind his back. The interrogation lasted 5 minutes, maybe 10. Time stretching in that way it does when you are watching someone's life being weighed on scales you cannot see. Finally, the interrogator stepped back, consulted with the Inquisitor in a whisper, and the Inquisitor nodded once. A purity seal was pressed into Kellen's palm, wax still warm, and he was directed to stand against the far wall with the handful of other overseers who had already passed. His relief was visible in the sag of his shoulders, in the way he clutched the seal like it was the Emperor's own benediction. 17 more overseers were questioned. 14 received seals, 3 were taken. The first was dragged screaming to the holding pens the stormtroopers had set up near the entrance, his voice cracking as he swore his loyalty, swore he had done nothing wrong, swore the Emperor was his salvation. The second went quietly, her face blank, her eyes already dead. The third tried to run, made it perhaps 10 steps before a Helgen shot took him in the leg. The last, bolt cooking meat and bone with a smell that made my stomach heave. He was dragged the rest of the way, leaving a trail of charred blood on the rockcrete, and the message was clear: resistance was not tolerated. Even the impulse toward resistance was proof of guilt. The interrogations moved into the general workforce. The servo skull's auspex scanned constantly, pulling names from personnel records, flagging individuals based on criteria I could not fathom. Production history, psychological profiles, attendance records, prayer participation rates. Everything we did was logged, archived, analyzed, and now weaponized against us. My name was called in the 20th hour, after I had watched 60 workers questioned and 12 executed on the spot. Their bodies left where they fell as warnings and examples. My legs were numb from kneeling, my bladder screaming, my mind fuzzy from fear and exhaustion. I stood, and Heshia's hand slipped from my wrist, and I walked forward through the crowd that parted for me, like I was already contaminated. The interrogator gestured for me to kneel in the center of the hall, in the space where the Inquisitor could see me clearly, where the servo skull could scan me from every angle, where the entire workforce could witness my judgment. The rockcrete was cold and stained with fluids I did not want to identify. I knelt, and the impact sent pain lancing up my thighs, and I kept my head bowed, because eye contact felt like challenge, and challenge was death. The interrogator's boots entered my field of vision. Scuffed black leather that had walked through more blood than I could imagine. Her first question cut through the haze of my fear. Do you love the Emperor? The words should have been simple, should have triggered the automatic response I had been trained to give since childhood. But my mouth was dry and my tongue felt swollen, and the yes that emerged sounded more like a croak than an affirmation. She waited, her rebreather hissing in the silence, and I tried again, forcing volume into my voice. Yes, I love the Emperor. He is the master of mankind, the guardian of terror, the light in the darkness. The liturgy spilled out, rote and desperate, and I prayed to him that it would be enough. Recite the litany of devotion. I began, stumbled on the third line, my mind blank with terror, and then the words came back in a rush, and I continued, my voice gaining strength as muscle memory overrode panic. I finished the litany, moved into the prayer of protection without being asked, poured every scrap of faith I possessed into the words, and when I finally stopped, my throat was raw and my eyes were burning with tears I refused to let fall. The interrogator let the silence stretch, let me hang in the moment of uncertainty, and then she moved to the next question. When did you last attend chapel? 14 days prior, I told her, which was true. I had attended the dawn service on my rest day, had recited the prayers with hundreds of other workers, had taken the communion wafer that tasted like sawdust, and represented the Emperor's flesh feeding his children. 14 days felt like a confession of neglect when spoken aloud, like I should have gone more often, like the gap itself was evidence of wavering faith. The interrogator's head tilted, a gesture that might have been curiosity or condemnation. Why not more frequently? I explained that my shift schedule made daily attendance difficult, that I prayed at my station during work hours, that faith was not measured in physical presence, but in devotion of the heart. The words sounded like excuses, like rationalizations for laziness or doubt, and I hated how defensive they made me sound. The interrogator's gloved hand reached out, gestured for me to continue, and I told her that I kept a small icon of the imperial ocula above my bunk, that I recited evening prayers before sleep, that the Emperor was in my thoughts even when I could not be in his chapels. She said nothing, simply turned to the servo skull and made a notation I could not see. Do you dream? The question landed like a blow. Dreams were dangerous territory, the place where the warp could seep into an unguarded mind, where daemons whispered and chaos planted seeds that grew into corruption. I wanted to lie, to say I slept soundly and dreamlessly, but the interrogation had already taken hours, and my exhaustion was obvious, and claiming perfect sleep would be more suspicious than admitting to dreams. Yes, I said carefully. Everyone dreams. It is the nature of the human mind to process the day's events during sleep. What do you dream about? The interrogator leaned closer, her rebrether inches from my face, and I could see my reflection in her mask's faceplate, distorted and small and terrified. I told her I dreamed of the manufactorum, of the assembly line, of the prayers we recited, and the rifle stocks that moved past my station. I told her I dreamed of my childhood on the agricultural levels, of the grox pens and the nutrient gardens and the smell of fertilizer. I told her mundane things, safe things, dreams that had the texture of memory rather than the strangeness of warp intrusion. I did not tell her about the colors I sometimes saw, the shapes that moved in my peripheral vision during sleep, the voices that spoke in languages that made my teeth ache. Those dreams I buried, locked away in the part of my mind I did not examine, because acknowledging them would be acknowledging vulnerability. She studied me in silence, and I could feel the weight of her assessment, could feel her measuring my words against some internal standard I could not access. Finally, she produced a device from her belt, a brass cylinder perhaps 20 centimeters long, with glass vials embedded in its surface, and a needle that gleamed in the overhead lights. This will determine if your blood carries the taint of warp exposure, of Xeno's contamination, of mutation. The test is sacred, sanctioned by the Inquisition and blessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus. It does not lie. She pressed the device against my temple, just above my left ear, and I felt the needle punch through skin and into bone with a sharp cold pain that made me gasp. The device hummed, a vibration that traveled through my skull and made my teeth rattle, and I could feel my blood being drawn through the needle, pulled into the vials with suction that felt like violation. The extraction lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like hours, and when she withdrew the device, there was blood trickling down my neck, warm and sticky, and the hole the needle left behind throbbed with each heartbeat. The interrogator held the device up to the light, studying the vials that had filled with my blood, dark red, almost black in the manufactorum's artificial illumination. She handed it to the scribe without comment, and his fingers danced across his lectern's input keys. Data scrolling across screens I could not see. The servo skull descended to hover beside him, its auspex units focusing on the blood samples with mechanical precision that felt more judgmental than any human gaze. I knelt there, bleeding from the needle wound, waiting for judgment, and the seconds stretched into eternities measured in heartbeats and labored breathing. The scribe's fingers stopped. The servo skull emitted a soft chime, musical and incongruous in the tense silence. The interrogator turned to the Inquisitor, and he stepped forward, his grey eyes studying me with that same professional detachment. Acceptable, he said, and the word was deliverance. A purity seal was pressed into my palm, wax still warm from the blessing, and I was directed to the far wall, where the others who had passed stood in shell, shocked rows. I walked on legs that barely supported me, clutching the seal like it was the only thing anchoring me to life, and I found a space against the wall and pressed my back against it, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Heresy was called 3 hours later. I watched her walk forward, her prayer beads clicking against her wrists, her faith visible in every line of her body. She knelt in the same spot I had knelt, and the interrogator circled her, and I could see Heshia's lips moving in constant prayer even as the questions were asked. Her answers were loud, fervent, full of the absolute certainty that had always defined her faith. She recited liturgies without stumbling, proclaimed her love for the Emperor with tears streaming down her face, detailed her chapel attendance and her devotions with the pride of someone who had nothing to hide. The blood test was administered. The device hummed. The vials filled. The scribe's fingers danced across his lectern, and I watched his movements from across the hall, watched the way his fingers suddenly stopped, watched the way the servo skull's chime sounded different this time, sharper, more urgent. The interrogator stepped back. The Inquisitor moved forward. Hesia's prayers grew louder, more desperate, and the storm troopers shifted their helguns from low ready to active positions. "No," Hesia said, and the word cut through her prayers like a blade. "No, I am faithful. I am pure. The Emperor is my light, my salvation, my purpose. I have done nothing wrong. I have served him all my life. Please, please, I am innocent." The Inquisitor knelt beside her, and his movements were almost gentle, and when he spoke his voice carried no anger or disgust, only the same professional calm he had maintained throughout the purge. "You are infected. The taint in your blood is microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, undetectable without specialized equipment. You were exposed to warp, touched material 17 months ago during a supply shipment from the lower hive. The shipment was contaminated by a cultist cell we have since eradicated. You did not know. You could not have known. Ignorance is not innocence, but it is also not guilt in the moral sense." He paused, and one of his scarred hands touched Hesia's shoulder with something that might have been compassion. "The corruption will grow. In 5 years, perhaps 10, you would have become a gateway for warp entities that would slaughter everyone in this facility. You would have suffered as they tore through you into real space. Your death now prevents that suffering. It prevents the deaths of your co-workers. It serves the Emperor's will." Hesia's face collapsed into something I had no words for, grief and terror and betrayal all mixed together. "Then save me. The Inquisition has resources, methods, there must be something." The Inquisitor shook his head, a small movement that carried absolute finality. "The taint is in your cells, woven into your genetic structure. Purification would require destroying you completely and rebuilding from molecular foundations, technology that exists only in the deepest archives of Mars and is reserved for those whose value to the Imperium justifies the expenditure. You are a manufactorum worker. The cost-benefit analysis does not favor your salvation. I am sorry." He drew a bolt pistol from the holster at his hip, a massive weapon decorated with purity seals and scripture, and pressed it against Hesia's forehead. She had time for one more prayer, the first line of the litany of protection, and then he pulled the trigger and the mass, reactive bolt punched through her skull and detonated inside her brain cavity, and her head came apart in a spray of blood and bone and gray matter that painted the rockcrete in patterns my mind tried to find meaning in and failed. Her body remained kneeling for a moment, propped up by rigor and momentum, and then it toppled sideways and lay still, and the Inquisitor holstered his weapon and blessed the corpse with a gesture I did not recognize and moved on to the next name on the list. I stood against the wall with my purity seal clutched in my hand, and I could not look away from Hesia's body, from the way her fingers were still curled around her prayer beads, from the way her mouth was open in the shape of the Emperor's name. I had known her for 12 years. We had shared a bunk, had argued about faith, had eaten together and worked together, and existed in each other's orbit with the casual intimacy of people who survive by cooperation. Now she was meat and bone and cooling blood, and the Imperium had decided her death was necessary, and I was alive because my blood had tested clean, and the guilt of survival wrapped around my throat like a noose. The purge continued through the night and into the next day. 47 workers were executed on the spot, bolt pistols and helguns ending lives with brutal efficiency. 12 more were taken for further interrogation, loaded into armored transports marked with the Inquisitorial seal, and we never learned what happened to them, though the screaming from the lower levels suggested nothing merciful. The rest of us, the survivors, stood against the walls and watched and learned that faith was not armor, that devotion was not protection, that the Imperium you served with every fiber of your being could decide you were expendable, and there was nothing you could do but accept judgment and pray for a quick death. When the Inquisitor finally left, ascending back to his shuttle with his retinue in tow, the silence in the manufactorum was absolute. We stood in the meal hall surrounded by bodies, surrounded by blood, surrounded by the wreckage of lives we had known, and no one spoke. The overseers did not give orders. The cogitators did not chime. Even the machines on the lower levels seemed to pause, as if the spirits within them were mourning or judging, or simply waiting to see what we would do with the knowledge that we were disposable. Eventually, the Vox system crackled back to life, and the manufactorum supervisor's voice emerged, thin and strained and trying for authority it no longer possessed. Our workers will return to their stations. Production has fallen behind during the purge. The Imperium's war machine does not pause for grief. The soldiers on the front lines need weapons. We will meet our quotas. We will serve the Emperor. This is our duty. This is our purpose. The words should have been rallying, should have given us something to focus on besides the corpses, but they landed flat and hollow, and when we filed back to our stations we moved like the dead ourselves. I stood at Station 40, 7 Gamma and blessed rifle stocks until my voice gave out. The prayers felt meaningless, sounds without content. But I recited them because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant remembering Hesia's face, and I could not do that and remain functional. Around me, the other workers did the same, 600 people performing rituals that had become purely mechanical, serving a machine we no longer believed would protect us but could not afford to abandon. The shift lasted 16 hours. No one complained. Complaining drew attention, and attention was death. 3 days after the purge, a servo skull appeared at my station during the night shift. It was different from the one the Inquisitor had used, smaller, with faded script etched into its surface that I could not read in the poor light. It hovered in front of my face until I stopped working, until I met its Auspex unit gaze, and then it projected a hololithic message in flickering green text. Theron Vask, report to Administratum Office 7, Level Spire, Apex, immediately. Non-compliance will be noted. The message dissolved, and the servo skull rotated and flew away. And I stood there with a half-blessed rifle stock in my hands and terror rising in my throat like bile. The other workers did not look at me. Looking was acknowledging, and acknowledgement meant association, and association with someone being summoned could spread like contagion. I set the rifle stock down on the conveyor belt, stepped away from my station, and walked through the manufactorum toward the elevator shafts that led to the upper levels. The journey took an hour, through corridors I had never walked, past checkpoints where armed guards scanned my work identification and my purity seal with suspicion that made my hands shake. The elevator shaft groaned and creaked as it carried me up through levels of increasing administrative importance, the architecture changing from industrial rockcrete to polished stone, the air losing its oil and sweat stench and gaining the smell of parchment and incense. Administratum Office 7 occupied a space that had once been a chapel, the original devotional mosaic still visible beneath layers of filing cabinets and data lecterns. The room was cramped despite its high ceiling, every surface covered with documents and scrolls and data, slates that represented the endless bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium. Behind a desk made from reclaimed starship plating sat an old woman with augmetic eyes that whirred and clicked when she focused on me, mechanical pupils dilating and contracting as they scanned my face and compared it to records I could not see. She did not introduce herself. She did not waste time with pleasantries or reassurances. She simply slid a data slate across the desk, the movement economical and practiced, and told me to read. The document displayed on the slate was a transfer order, dense with administrative codes and official seals, but the core message was clear. I was being reassigned from manufactorum work to the Administratum's census division. My production numbers during the purge had been flagged as exemplary, my psychological profile deemed stable, my faith confirmed by Inquisitorial review. The transfer was effective immediately. Refusal was not an option. I tried to protest, tried to explain that I was content where I was, that I had worked the same station for 12 years, that changing now felt like punishment for surviving when others had not. The old woman's augmetic eyes clicked, refocusing, and her voice when she spoke was flat and final. The Inquisitor himself recommended you. He noted your composure under extreme stress, your adherence to protocol, your visible faith. The Imperium has used for such qualities in positions of greater responsibility. To refuse this transfer is to question the Inquisitor's judgment. To question the Inquisition is heresy. You will report to Census Division Sub, Section 14 tomorrow at the beginning of first shift. This conversation is concluded. I signed the data, slate with a stylus that felt too heavy in my hand. The pressure of my signature, creating a legally binding acceptance of a future I had not chosen. The old woman took the slate back, stamped it with a seal that smelled of hot wax and authority, and dismissed me with a gesture. I walked out of the office, back down through the hive levels, and when I reached my bunk, Kellen was waiting for me. His empty eye socket was red and raw, and he gripped my shoulder with a hand that trembled. "You are lucky," he said, and the word felt obscene. "The Administratum is safer than the floor, less physical danger, more opportunity for advancement. Thank the Emperor for this blessing." I wanted to tell him that blessings did not feel like being torn from everything familiar and thrown into uncertainty. I wanted to tell him that luck and survival were not the same thing. That being singled out by the Inquisition felt less like salvation and more like being marked by something I could not escape. Instead, I thanked him, and he released me, and I packed my few possessions into a canvas sack and walked out of the manufactorum barracks for the last time. Behind me, the machines continued their grinding work, and ahead of me waited a future I had not asked for and could not refuse. The census division sprawled across 6 levels of a hab block that had been converted into office space so long ago that the original residential architecture was barely visible beneath layers of filing cabinets and data lecterns. The air here was different, still and dusty, with the smell of old parchment and the faint ozone tang of cogitators running constant calculations. My new station was a desk wedged between 2 others in a room that held 40 similar desks, each one occupied by a worker hunched over documents, their fingers stained with ink, their eyes red from reading faded script by candlelight. My supervisor was Corvin, a man so thin he looked like the parchment he worked with, all sharp angles and bloodless skin, with ink stains on his fingers that had become permanent tattoos. He spoke in whispers, as if the walls themselves were listening, and he checked every document 3 times before filing it. And he taught me that mistakes in the census division were not punished with reprimands. Mistakes were investigated. Investigations drew attention. Attention from the Administratum was a slower death than attention from the Inquisition, but no less certain. My job was to verify birth and death records from the lower hive, cross-referencing them against tithe quotas and production numbers and flagging discrepancies for further review. Each entry represented a human life reduced to data points: date of birth, assigned work designation, productivity metrics, date of death, cause if known, organs harvested for servitor conversion if applicable. I processed hundreds of entries per shift, and each one blurred into the next until they stopped being people and became pure information, numbers to be validated and filed and forgotten. The work was mined, numbing in a way that manufactorum labor had never been. At least on the assembly line, there had been the satisfaction of creating something tangible, of seeing the rifle stocks move past and knowing that somewhere a soldier would hold what I had blessed. Here there was only paper and data, endless chains of verification that served purposes I could not see, contributing to an administrative machine so vast that my individual labor was meaningless. But the work was safe, or as safe as anything could be in the Imperium. And I threw myself into it with the desperation of someone who needed distraction from memories that clawed at me every time I closed my eyes. The nightmares started 3 weeks after my transfer. I would dream of Hessia kneeling in the manufactorum. But when the Inquisitor pulled the trigger, the bolt never reached her, hung in the air between his gun and her head, and she would turn to look at me with eyes that were no longer human, eyes that swirled with colors I had no names for. And she would ask me why I had survived when she had not, why my blood had tested clean when hers was tainted, and I would wake gasping and covered in sweat with no answer to give. Other dreams followed, stranger ones, less grounded in memory. I dreamed of corridors that stretched into infinity, lit by a light that came from nowhere and revealed nothing. I dreamed of voices speaking in languages that hurt my ears, that made my teeth ache, that left me with the taste of copper in my mouth when I woke. I dreamed of shapes moving in my peripheral vision, things that vanished when I turned to look at them directly, but left impressions like bruises on my consciousness. I never mentioned the dreams. Dreams were private, and privacy was the only freedom we had, and admitting to warp-touched visions was signing my own execution warrant. But the dreams left me exhausted, hollowed out, and Corvin noticed. He pulled me aside after a shift where I had nearly flagged a correct entry as discrepant because my eyes could no longer focus, and he whispered that the Inquisition had left watchers in the manufactorum, that several workers who had passed the initial purge had been taken in the weeks after, that purity seals were not permanent protection, but temporary reprieves. He did not elaborate, but the message was clear: I was being observed, had always been observed, would always be observed, and survival meant perfect behavior in every moment, because there was no such thing as unwatched privacy in the Imperium. The paranoia that followed was suffocating in ways I had not experienced even during the purge. At least then the threat had been visible, embodied in the Inquisitor and his retinue, something I could see and fear appropriately. Now the threat was everywhere and nowhere, embedded in every conversation, every interaction, every moment of silence. I examined my own words before speaking them, analyzed my thoughts for traces of doubt or heresy, monitored my dreams for signs of warp corruption. I became my own Inquisitor, judging myself more harshly than any external authority could. Because the punishment for internal failure was death, and I had seen enough death to know exactly what that meant. I stopped attending the communal meal halls because conversation was dangerous. Every word you spoke could be misinterpreted. Every question you asked could be construed as doubt. Every silence could be read as concealment. I ate alone in my bunk, corpse, starch rations that I chewed mechanically, while reviewing my work for the day, searching for errors I might have missed, mistakes that could draw the wrong kind of attention. I stopped going to chapel because the prayers felt like traps, waiting to catch me in a misremembered line. And the other worshippers felt like potential informants, and the priests themselves might be inquisitorial agents monitoring for signs of wavering faith. I withdrew into myself, made my presence as small as possible, became a ghost that processed paperwork, and existed in the spaces between notice and significance. The other workers in the census division learned not to speak to me, learned that I would not respond to casual conversation or questions about my past or anything that required revealing information that could be weaponized. I became efficient and silent and invisible, and I told myself that invisibility was survival, that the smaller I made myself, the safer I would be. But the truth was darker. I was erasing myself, piece by piece, scraping away every part of my personality that could draw attention until nothing remained but the function I performed. 6 months after my transfer, the second purge began. It was quieter than the first, more surgical, conducted without the theatrical arrival of power, armored inquisitors. Instead, servo skulls appeared at random intervals, hovering over workstations until the person beneath them stood and followed, and those people never returned. Their desks were cleaned within hours, their belongings distributed to the Administratum stores, their names struck from the rosters as if they had never existed. The rest of us did not ask questions, because questions drew attention to the pattern. And noticing patterns meant you were thinking about things that were not your business, and that kind of thinking was how you ended up following a servo skull into the lower levels. Corvin disappeared on a night shift, his desk cleared by morning, and the new supervisor who replaced him was younger, harder, with augmetic implants in his throat that made his voice sound like scraping metal. He announced that productivity expectations were being increased by 15%, that errors would be punished with reassignment to more dangerous work details, that the Emperor's gaze was upon us, and we would prove ourselves worthy through diligence and obedience. He did not mention Corvin. No one mentioned Corvin. Within a week it felt like he had never existed, another ghost in a hive full of them. I lasted 3 more months before the servo skull came for me. It appeared above my desk during the graveyard shift. When only 20 of us were working in the dim candlelight, our faces lit from below by the data, slates we read from. The servo skull's auspex units glowed red, and it made a sound like a musical chime, and I felt my bowels turn to water. Around me, the other workers kept their heads down, kept working, refused to acknowledge what was happening, because acknowledgement meant association. I stood on legs that barely supported me, and I followed the servo skull out of the workroom, through corridors I had never walked, down into sub-levels that smelled of mildew and decay and ancient things sealed away and forgotten. The architecture here was older, pre-imperial, the walls carved from rock rather than poured from rockcrete. I could see the bones of the original colony embedded in the stone, entire structures swallowed by the hive's growth and left to rot in the dark. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a sound like weeping, and the temperature dropped until I could see my breath misting in the air. The servo skull led me deeper, through passages that narrowed until I had to turn sideways to fit, until the ceiling pressed down and the walls closed in, and I had to fight the urge to run, because running was guilt and guilt was death. Finally, we emerged into a chamber that had once been something else, maybe a storage bay or a transit hub, now converted into an interrogation space. A single lumen strip hung from the ceiling, flickering and buzzing with failing power, casting shadows that moved wrong. A table sat in the center, and flanked by 2 chairs, and in one chair sat the interrogator from the manufactorum purge, her rebreather mask still in place, her gloved hands folded on the table's surface, with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. The servo skull took up position in the corner, its auspex units never leaving my face, and the door behind me closed with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The interrogator gestured to the empty chair, and I sat because there was nothing else to do. The chair was metal, cold enough to leach heat through my clothes, and I placed my hands on the table because hiding them felt like guilt. She watched me in silence, and the only sound was the hiss of her rebreather and the buzzes of the failing lumen and my own breathing that I could not slow, no matter how hard I tried. Minutes passed, or hours, time becoming meaningless in that flickering space, and finally she leaned forward and spoke. "You have done well, Theron Vask. Your work in the census division is exemplary. Your productivity is above average. Your error rate is negligible. Your faith is documented in your attendance records and prayer participation metrics. Your loyalty to the Imperium is not in question." She paused, and I waited for the inevitable contradiction, the but that would shatter the fragile hope her words had kindled. It came like a knife between the ribs. "But you are troubled. Your sleep is irregular. Your social interactions have ceased entirely. You exhibit signs of psychological strain consistent with chronic stress and potentially exposure to warp influence." I tried to protest, tried to explain that the strain was from the purge, from watching Heresy die, from living in constant fear that I would be next. The words tangled in my throat, came out sounding defensive and weak, and she raised one hand to silence me. "Trauma is understandable. Trauma is human. The Imperium does not punish suffering, only weakness that leads to corruption. But trauma creates vulnerabilities, cracks in the psyche where warp entities can find purchase. A mind under stress is a mind that cannot properly shield itself from the immaterium. You are a risk, Theron. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. The Inquisition does not wait for corruption to manifest. We identify potential vectors and eliminate them before they become active threats." She reached into her coat and withdrew the blood test device, the same brass cylinder with glass vials that I remembered from the manufactorum. She placed it on the table between us, and the vials caught the flickering light and seemed to glow from within. "You will submit to further examination. We will determine if you can be salvaged or if you represent an unacceptable risk. Refusal is admission of guilt. Compliance is your only path to survival. Do you understand?" I understood that I had no choice. I understood that the Inquisition had decided I was worth investigating, and investigation was the slow death that happened in rooms like this, in the dark places beneath the hive where screams were swallowed by stone and no one came looking for the bodies. I nodded, and she stood, and the examination began. They kept me in a cell for 3 days. The space was barely large enough to lie down in. Rockcrete walls that wept moisture and smelled of old urine and fear. Food came through a slot in the door, nutrient paste in portions too small to sustain me, and I understood that starvation was part of the process, that weakening the body made the mind more pliable, more likely to confess things that had never happened, just to make the questioning stop. I ate what they gave me and tried to preserve my strength and failed, because you cannot fight biology with willpower alone. The interrogations happened at irregular intervals, sometimes after what felt like hours, sometimes after what felt like days. They took me to the same chamber with the flickering lumen, sat me in the same chair, asked me the same questions in different orders, searching for inconsistencies, for the moment when exhaustion would make me slip and reveal the corruption they believed was hiding in my soul. The interrogator asked about my dreams, and I described them in detail, because hiding them now felt pointless, because maybe confessing them would satisfy whatever they were looking for. I told her about dreaming of Hestia, about the colors in her eyes that did not exist in real space, about the way she asked me questions I could not answer. I told her about the corridors that stretched forever, about the voices in languages I did not understand, about the shapes in my peripheral vision that vanished when I looked at them directly. She listened without interrupting, her rebreather hissing in steady rhythm, and when I finished she asked me how the dreams made me feel. I told her they made me feel afraid, guilty, confused, exhausted. She asked if I had ever felt drawn to the things in the dreams, if I had ever wanted to understand the voices or see the shapes clearly. I told her no, that the dreams were torment, that I would erase them if I could. On the second day she brought in a psyker, a broken thing wrapped in chains and suppressor tech, his eyes covered with a leather blindfold and his mouth sewn shut with wire. The psyker's handler, a priest in robes marked with the seal of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, explained that the psyker would read the surface of my thoughts, would detect any warp taint that might be hiding beneath conscious awareness. The process would be painful, but not damaging if I was pure. If I was corrupted, the psyker would know, and the knowledge would kill him, and I would be executed immediately afterward to prevent spread of contagion. They removed the psyker's blindfold, and his eyes were empty sockets filled with pale light that hurt to look at. He made sounds through his sewn lips, sounds that might have been words or might have been screaming, and I felt his presence in my mind like cold fingers peeling back layers of thought. The sensation was violating in ways I had no comparison for, worse than the blood test needle, worse than the interrogation questions, a complete exposure of self that left nothing private or protected. I felt him moving through my memories, through my fears, through the small secret doubts I had buried so deeply I had almost forgotten they existed. The psyker's handler watched his charge with the attention of someone monitoring a dangerous animal, and when the psyker suddenly convulsed and vomited black fluid through his sewn lips, the handler pulled him back and replaced the blindfold with movements that spoke of long practice. The psyker was dragged from the room, still convulsing, and the interrogator leaned forward and asked what I had been thinking about in the moment the psyker had reacted. I told her I had been thinking about nothing, about trying to keep my mind blank, about the fear that any thought might be the wrong one. She made a notation on a data slate I had not noticed her holding. On the third day she administered the blood test again. The needle punched into my temple with the same cold violation. The device hummed. The vials filled with my blood that looked almost black in the poor light. She withdrew the device and studied the vials in silence that stretched until I thought I would scream just to break it. Finally she set the vials down, removed her rebreather mask, and I saw her face for the second time. She looked older than I remembered, the scars on her cheeks deeper, her eyes more tired, as if the work she did aged her in ways that went beyond normal time. "You are clean," she said, and I felt relief crash through me like a wave, like drowning in reverse, like being pulled from water I had not realized was closing over my head. The blood shows no taint. The psyker detected doubt, anxiety, trauma, but no warp corruption. Your dreams are the natural result of stress and fear, not evidence of demonic intrusion. You are psychologically damaged but not compromised. She paused, and I waited for the rest, for the punishment that would come even though I had passed. However, you represent a statistical risk. Your psychological profile indicates vulnerability to corruption under continued stress. The Imperium cannot afford to monitor you indefinitely. You will be assigned to a new position, one with reduced stress and increased oversight. You will attend mandatory counseling sessions with the ecclesiarchy. You will submit to regular blood testing. Any deviation from this protocol will result in immediate termination. She replaced her mask, stood, and opened the door. I stumbled out of the cell, up the stairs, back into the census division, and I sat at my desk and stared at the parchment stacks and felt nothing. The relief I had felt in the interrogation room had evaporated, replaced by the understanding that I had not been freed, but placed under permanent suspicion. That the rest of my life would be spent proving over and over that I was not corrupted. That each day was a test I might fail without warning. The mandatory counseling sessions began the following week. They were held in a chapel annex, a small room with a faded mural of the Emperor's ascension and a priest who introduced himself as Father Malleus. He was old, with a voice like gravel and hands that shook with palsy, but his eyes were sharp and his questions were sharper. He asked about my faith, about my relationship with the Emperor, about whether I believed he could hear my prayers from terror. I gave him the answers he wanted to hear, professions of devotion and certainty, and he nodded and made notations in a leather-bound book I was not allowed to see. The sessions happened twice weekly, each one an hour of theological discussion that felt less like counseling and more like continued interrogation. Father Malleus probed for doubt, for questions, for any sign that my faith was performative rather than genuine. I learned to perform perfectly, to recite the liturgies with the right emotional inflection, to speak about the Emperor with reverence that sounded sincere because I had practiced it until sincerity and performance were indistinguishable. After 3 months, Father Malleus declared me spiritually stable, and the sessions were reduced to once weekly. But they never stopped entirely. The blood tests continued monthly, administered by medical staff who wore the Inquisitorial seal on their uniforms and did not speak beyond the necessary instructions. Each test was a reminder that I was not trusted, that my continued existence was contingent on biological purity I could not control, that at any moment my cells might betray me and I would die for corruption I had not chosen. I lived in a state of permanent tension, waiting for the test that would come back tainted, for the medica to look at the vials and call for the storm troopers, for my life to end in a bolt pistol's roar. Years passed. The tension did not ease. The nightmares continued, though I learned to manage them. To wake before the worst parts, to recite prayers in the dark until my heart rate slowed and I could convince myself to sleep again. The work in the census division became automatic, my hands filing documents and verifying data, while my mind drifted through empty spaces that felt safer than engaging with reality. I watched other workers disappear, watched new faces arrive, and learn the same lessons I had learned. Watched the endless cycle of purge and replacement and the grinding normality that filled the spaces between catastrophes. I stopped marking time in conventional ways, stopped counting birthdays or anniversaries, because those measurements assumed progress or meaning and I had neither. Instead, I counted blood tests, survival measured in monthly intervals, in vials that came back clean in the absence of servo, skulls appearing above my desk. 48 blood tests, 72 blood tests, 100. Each one a stay of execution, each one proof that I had survived another month, though survival felt less like achievement and more like endurance without purpose. The Imperium ground on. Wars were fought on worlds whose names I would never know. Manufactorums produced weapons. Census workers filed reports. The machine of humanity turned and I was a component within it, replaceable and insignificant, kept alive not because my life had value, but because replacing me would be marginally more expensive than maintaining me. I understood this. Understanding it was part of survival. Accepting it was the price of continuing to draw breath. On my 120th blood test, something changed. The medico who administered the injection paused when looking at the vials, called over a colleague, and they conferred in whispers I could not hear. They took additional samples, 3 more vials worth, and told me to wait in the examination room while they ran further analysis. I sat on the cold metal examination table and felt the certainty of death settling over me like a shroud. Because something in my blood had finally betrayed me, because the taint they had been waiting for had manifested, because my time was finished. The wait lasted 2 hours. When the medici returned, they brought a priest and a stormtrooper, and I knew what that meant. Priests delivered last rites. Stormtroopers delivered execution. I stood because sitting felt like cowardice. And if I was going to die, I would do it with whatever dignity I could maintain. The priest opened a small book and began reciting the prayer of the Emperor's mercy, and I joined him because the words were familiar and familiar things were comforting, even when they preceded death. But the stormtrooper did not draw his weapon. Instead, he produced a data slate and handed it to me, and I read the text through vision blurred with tears I had not realized were falling. The analysis had detected anomalies in my blood, markers consistent with long-term low-level exposure to suppressed psychogenetics. I was not corrupted. I was not tainted by chaos. I was a latent psyker. My abilities so minimal they had never manifested, so deeply buried that they registered only as statistical noise. The Inquisition's protocols for latent psykers were clear. Immediate transfer to an Adeptus Astra Telepathica facility for evaluation and potential training, or, if the abilities were too weak to be useful, sanctioning for use as a psychic resonator in Imperium infrastructure. I was being transferred to a black ship, the prison vessels that collected psykers from across the Imperium and transported them to Terra for the Emperor's judgment. My departure was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I was confined to monitored quarters, forbidden from contact with other workers, kept under armed guard to prevent any possibility of escape or psychic manifestation. I sat in those quarters, in a room barely larger than the interrogation cell had been, and I tried to feel something about this revelation. Fear, anger, resignation. But I felt nothing. Just the same hollow numbness that had defined my existence since the first purge. The black ship arrived on schedule, a massive void-faring vessel that docked at the hive's highest spire and loaded cargo that included me and 37 other latent psykers identified on Kratos Tertius. We were shackled and blindfolded and led through corridors that smelled of incense and burning flesh, crammed into holding cells that held 20 people in a space meant for 10. The journey to Terra would take months, maybe years depending on warp currents and the ship's schedule, and during that time we would be tested and evaluated and sorted into categories that would determine our fates. Some of us would prove strong enough for training, would become sanctioned psykers serving the Imperium's various branches, their minds bound with wards and their souls scarred by the training process, but their lives preserved in service. Some would be too weak for field use, but suitable for static positions, becoming astropathic relays or psychic resonators in communication arrays. Their consciousness sacrificed to maintain the Imperium's vast information network. Some would be deemed suitable for the Golden Throne. The 10,000 daily sacrifices that powered the Astronomicon and kept the Emperor's spirit sustained within his decaying physical form. I did not know which category I would fall into. The black ship's crew did not share that information, did not speak to us beyond the minimum necessary instructions. We were cargo, not passengers. Our humanity relevant only insofar as it affected our utility. I sat in the holding cell with the other latent psykers, most of them younger than me, many of them weeping or praying or staring at nothing with expressions I recognized from mirrors. We were the Imperium's fuel, about to be fed into the machine that powered humanity's survival across 1,000,000 worlds. The irony was not lost on me. I had survived the Inquisition. I had passed every test, every interrogation, every blood screening. I had done everything right, had maintained my faith and my loyalty and my obedience to every protocol. And in the end it had not mattered, because my genetics had betrayed me, because something in my cells that I had not asked for and could not control had marked me as too dangerous to remain free. The Imperium I had served with every fiber of my being had decided I was more valuable as fuel than as a worker, and there was nothing I could do but accept the judgment and hope that whatever came next would be quick. The black ship slipped from Kratos Tertius's docking spire and translated into the warp, and through the walls of the holding cell, I could hear the Jellifield generators humming. The technology that kept us separated from the immaterium we traveled through. Beyond those fields were things that would shred my soul and feast on my consciousness, daemons that waited for any crack in the protection to pour through and take possession of flesh too weak to resist. The psychers in the cell with me could feel them, could sense the presence of the warp, even through the field's protection, and their terror was a physical thing, a sound that started as whimpering and rose to screaming that went on for hours until the crew flooded the cell with sedative gas. I did not scream. I had nothing left to scream about. Fear required the energy of hope, required believing that things could be different if only you fought hard enough or ran fast enough or prayed fervently enough. I had no hope left. Hope had died in the manufactorum when Heshia's head exploded. It had died in the interrogation rooms when I realized that innocence was not protection. It had died in the countless blood tests and counseling sessions and moments of paranoia that made up my existence. What remained was acceptance. Not peace, but the absence of resistance, the understanding that my life had never belonged to me, and pretending otherwise had been delusion. The journey through the warp lasted 4 months by the black ship's chronometers, though time in the immaterium does not flow consistently, and it might have been longer or shorter in real space. The crew kept us sedated for most of it, waking us only for medical examinations and psychic evaluations that involved psychers stronger than us probing our minds with the same invasive coldness I remembered from the interrogation. Each evaluation left me exhausted and hollow, and I could see the same exhaustion in the other latent psychers, could see them being worn down by the process until they were as empty as I was. When we finally translated back into real space and approached Terra, the throne world itself, I was brought to a viewing port for the first time since boarding. The sight was meant to inspire awe, to remind us of the Imperium's majesty and the Emperor's power, to give us pride in the sacrifice we were about to make. Terra hung in the void like a diseased eye, the planet's surface hidden beneath layers of hive cities and industrial sprawl that covered every continent and ocean. The Astronomicon blazed from the Imperial Palace at the planet's north pole, a psychic beacon so bright that even we latent psychers could feel it, a scream of psychic energy that reached across the galaxy and guided ships through the warp. I felt nothing looking at it. No awe, no pride. Just the recognition that I was looking at the heart of the Imperium, the place where the Emperor's physical form sat entombed in the golden throne, where 10,000 psychers died every day to keep him sustained, where the Administratum's archives stretched for kilometers beneath the surface and held records of every citizen who had ever lived and died in service to mankind's survival. I was about to become another record, another entry in an endless ledger, Another sacrifice in the name of humanity's continued existence against the horrors of the galaxy. The black ship docked at one of Terra's orbital platforms, and we were transferred to shuttlecraft that descended through the planet's atmosphere, through layers of clouds that were not natural but industrial, smog and pollution so thick that the surface was barely visible until we were nearly touching down. The facility where they took us was massive, a fortress monastery complex dedicated to processing the constant influx of psychers from across the Imperium. We were sorted by evaluation results, our shackles marked with colored codes that determined our destinations. My code was amber, which meant low-grade psychic potential suitable for static infrastructure support. I was placed in a group of 300 similar cases, and we were led through the facility to a preparation chamber where priests of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica explained what would happen next. We would be surgically modified, our minds bound with wards and suppressor tech, and then installed in the psychic relay network that powered Terra's communications infrastructure. We would spend the rest of our lives as components in the system, our consciousness spread thin across vast distances, our individuality dissolved in service to the collective need. The process would take 3 days. We would be unconscious for all of it. When we woke, we would no longer be individuals but parts of a greater whole. Some of the psychers around me wept. Others prayed. A few tried to resist, were subdued by servitors and dragged away for processing regardless of their will. I simply stood and waited my turn, and when it came I walked into the surgical theater on my own feet and lay down on the table and let them strap me in. The last thing I saw before they administered the anesthetic was a priest making the sign of the Aquila over my chest, blessing the sacrifice I was about to make, thanking me for my service to the Imperium. The last thing I thought before consciousness faded was that I had survived the Inquisition only to discover that survival was not escape, that the Imperium found use for everyone eventually, that there was no freedom in service, only varying degrees of subjugation, and that I had spent my entire life believing compliance would protect me, when the truth was that protection was an illusion and the only certainty that the machine would use you until you broke and then replace you with someone else who had not yet learned how disposable they were. I am Theron Vask, and I survived the Inquisition. I wish that had mattered. Yet in the endless archives of the Imperium, there are countless stories like mine, voices silenced, fates consumed, truths hidden. If you would bear witness to more of these forbidden chronicles, remain with us, subscribe, return and step once more into the darkness of Warhammer 40K, for the next tale is already waiting.